Fellow citizens, my name is David Abdulah, political leader of the Movement for Social Justice, the MSJ, and I'm taking this opportunity to address the real Petrotrin story. This has become necessary as election day is Monday, and the party in government is still sharing misleading information about Petrotrin and offering up reasons for its closure that just don't stand careful scrutiny. This is not the first time that I'm providing the public with this information. But let me first establish why I'm in the position to provide you with the real story. As many of you may know, I worked at the Oilfields Workers Trade Union for 39 years, and at that time held various positions. Head of the Education and Research Department from 1978 to 2008, and while in that post I was also Executive Treasurer from 1982 to 1990. I was the union's General Secretary from 2008 to my retirement in 2016. As head of E&R, I obviously had to research the oil industry and represented the union at very many local, regional, and international conferences. I therefore believe that I have some knowledge of the oil industry in Trinidad and Tobago. On August 28, 2018, the Board of Directors of Petrotrin announced that on November 30, 2018, Petrotrin would be no more. The refinery would be shut down and all the employees would be sent home. Although I had retired from the union some 2.5 years before, I was asked to do media interviews on this announcement. I therefore appeared on one TV station that very night, another 2 the next day, as well as the radio. The MSJ hosted a breakfast forum on the issue and had several non-union professionals speak about why the government's decision was wrong. I was a panelist at 3 public forums on the issue, 2 of which also had the participation of Petrotrin's chairman, Wilfred Espinay. All of this between the date of the announcement and the date of the closure. Since 2018, I've spoken about the false narratives by the government on many media interviews, as well as through the MSJ's media conferences and our Tuesday talk. Very importantly, I gave evidence before the Industrial Court, which was hearing the dispute about the company's closure. Today, I'm once again going to tell the real story of the Petrotrin closure, as it's important for you to take this into account as you consider how you will use your vote come Monday. I will tell the story using facts, actual data, and other information, as many citizens, unfortunately, are not aware of the oil industry, how it works, and what the company Petrotrin was doing. It is because of the lack of knowledge by citizens that the government was able to get away with making you believe their narrative, a narrative that was based on misinformation, half-truths, and innuendos. So point 1, November 30th, Petrotrin is closed down. All 6,000 workers, from top management all the way down to temporary and casual workers, are sent home. This is in keeping with the position of Board Chairman Espinay's edict. All will go home. 4 new companies are established. Heritage Petroleum, which is involved in the exploration and production of crude. Paria Fuel Trading, which now imports fuel and sells to the domestic market, NP, Unipet, and so on, and to airlines. And then Guaracara Refining, which has the assets of the refinery, and Trinidad Petroleum Holdings Limited, which is the holding company for all of these, and Petrotrin remaining not as a company with assets or involved in production, but as a legacy company. For those unfamiliar with the oil industry, and Petrotrin in particular, what really was Petrotrin? It was what we call an integrated oil company. That is, from exploration and production on land and offshore, producing oil and exploring for oil, and offshore especially Trinma in the Gulf of Paria, to refining that oil to produce various products, aviation fuel, gasoline, diesel, LPG, and other refined products, and then selling those products, whether it be locally, regionally, or internationally. What was its business model? The refinery had a throughput rated of 160,000 barrels of oil a day. That is, 160,000 barrels of oil could go through the refinery to be processed into various products. Actually, it was operating at about 140,000 barrels of oil per day throughput. Petrotrin refined its own crude, that is, the crude that it got from its exploration and production division. It got crude from other local companies and foreign companies that produce crude locally, and imported crude. Oil production at the time in 2018, its own crude and other local crude, would not have met the full requirement of the refinery. All its revenue, all its earnings came from the sale of refined products. And therefore, in April of 2018, for example, Petrotrin was selling 28,000 barrels on the local market. Regionally, it was selling 30.7 thousand barrels per day, that is. Extra regionally, 18.7, that is other Caribbean countries outside of CARICOM, and internationally, 48,000 barrels. So in April of 2018, it was selling 125,000 barrels a day. And the products that it was producing at that time, in April of 2018, 1.7 thousand barrels of LPG, 47,000 barrels of motor fuel, 13.6 thousand barrels of aviation fuel, 24.8 thousand barrels of gas oil, and another 38.3 thousand barrels of fuel oil, giving us a total of 125.4 thousand barrels of throughput per day. So that is what Petrotrin was producing. Now, their contribution to the margins in terms of what the products contributed to the profitability, LPG was a loss-making one, and that is because essentially Petrotrin, I'll talk about that later, was not getting income from LPG. It provided that free to the public of Trinidad and Tobago. $7.65 per barrel was earned with motor fuel. $2.29 US per barrel was earned on jet fuel. 3.75 per barrel US was earned on gas oil, and it was losing $2.29 per barrel on fuel oil. And so in terms of the contribution to where it was earning its money by market outreach, locally, $4.13 US per barrel was earned from the local market, $4.49 US was earned from the regional market, extra regional was $2.26 US per barrel. Internationally, it was losing 58 cents per barrel, and bunker fuel, it was earning 50 cents per barrel. So that is what Petrotrin was doing in terms of its throughput, the type of products it produced, where those products went, and the value of those products in terms of its overall revenue. So let us now look down, and in fact, when you look at that information, you will see that by selling internationally, regionally, and extra regionally, it was earning foreign exchange in that regard. So that is important for us to know as well. Now, because it was an integrated oil company, all the expenditure was actually listed against the refinery. So everything Petrotrin did in terms of expenses, whether it was in exploration and production, public relations, community outreach, other kinds of activity, legal and so on, all of those expenses, and I'll show that later, was listed against the refinery because the revenue all came out of the refinery because we're talking about an integrated oil company. Now, there was the various false narratives. What was the first false narrative that was told to the country by the government at the time? They said, and I'm sure you heard that the model of importing crude to refine was a model that would lose money. But you see, they could get away with saying that because many of our citizens don't know the history of refining in Trinidad and Tobago. So that in 1912, the first refinery was built by what was called United British Oil Fields of Trinidad, owned by Shell. It was a 100,000 barrels per day refinery, and that was in Point Fortin. Then we had Trinidad Leaseholds Limited, owned by Leaseholds of the UK, building the refinery at Pointe-à-Pierre, and which was later bought by Texaco in 1956. At its peak in the 1970s, Texaco's refinery at Pointe-à-Pierre had a capacity of 360,000 barrels per day throughput, one of the largest refineries in the world at the time. We had two smaller refineries that people don't know about. One in La Brea, a little 18,000 per day refinery owned by Antilles, later taken over by Texaco and closed down by Texaco. And a small thing in Santa Flora, which was really used more for lab purposes than anything else. Now, the Pointe-à-Pierre and Point Fortin refineries always relied on imported crude. Remember, 100,000 barrels per day Point, 360,000 Pointe-à-Pierre, that's 460,000 barrels throughput. We never ever produced in Trinidad and Tobago 460,000 barrels of crude a day. At peak in the 1970s, we may have produced about 250,000 barrels of oil a day. But most of that actually came from the East Coast and was being produced by Amoco, which was later bought by BP. Not a drop of that East Coast crude produced by Amoco was ever refined locally. So that Shell and Texaco, people might say, well, why did Shell and Texaco leave? They left because they're global company strategies. In the case of Shell, they got oil in the North Sea, and that was more lucrative than operating in Trinidad. And post-OPEC, the United States policy was to reduce dependence on imported oil. So Texaco decided it no longer needed our refinery in Trinidad. They could do their refining in the United States. And the issue, though, is that our model of refining was always based on imported crude, always. And so the Petrotrin people who grew up knowing this, whether they came from the old Shell Trintoc refinery in Point Fortin or the Texaco, later Trintoc, later Petrotrin refinery, they knew about importing crude and refining it and selling it, and they knew how to manage this. Importation was never an issue for our refinery. Now, it is also true that the more local and own crude that is available for the refinery, the better for the company's financial position. Since, of course, you don't need foreign exchange to buy crude because you're buying it from yourself, you know, in that sense. You don't need foreign exchange. And if you're buying it from, say, the people engaged in farm out and lease out operations, they will be paid in TT dollars. And for your own crude, there's no profit margin. So the more local crude that you have access to, the more profitable your refinery could be. However, the cost of your own crude is included in the expenditure of the refinery. Now, we also have to say that there was an incorrect strategy by Petrotrin in the early 2000s under the P&M board, Executive Chairman Malcolm Jones, deceased now, and the Energy Subcommittee of Cabinet, Prime Minister Patrick Manning, also deceased. And they decided to place nearly all the investment that Petrotrin was going to engage in the refinery upgrade, what is known as the gas optimization project. As a result, crude production continued to decline because, as everyone knows, our oil fields are old. We started producing oil at the turn of the 1900s, so our oil fields are old, they're mature fields, and they naturally decline. But there is plenty new oil out there, especially in the Gulf of Paria, but you need to invest in exploration and production. That was not happening. You needed more balance, so that while yes, you had to upgrade the refinery, so you produce higher valued products like motor fuels and aviation fuel and so on, but you also needed more of your own crude. And so that investment would have kept our crude production at the same level or better over the years. So that was the first false narrative, that because you're importing crude, the refinery was bound to lose money. That's not true. The second false narrative is that the refinery was losing money. You heard that for every barrel of crude, the refinery was losing $4 a barrel. That is wrong. So let us look at some of the information. And we are looking at the 2018 information, which would have been the last information available to the decision makers, the board and the cabinet, before the August 28th decision to close down the refinery. So Nigel Edwards, member of the board of directors of Petrotrin, appeared together with other board members and management of Petrotrin before the Joint Select Committee on Energy of the Parliament on the 21st of February 2018. And he said this, and I'm quoting Nigel Edwards now. It is on the Hansard, you could go and find it. I'm quoting. He said, in terms of analyzing the past, we have looked at the free cash flows of the company over the last 5 years, 2013-17. And the picture of the company, I suppose, on the one hand, is a little bit encouraging in the sense that the free cash flows over the last 5 years has been positive, US $270 million. Now you multiply that by just under 7 and you get something like, 1.6 billion TT dollars or thereabouts. Now, what is free cash flows? It's an accounting term. It's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. EBITDA, in short. Now, what is this? There's a definition. It is, we have said, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, and is an alternate measure of profitability, and we took this off the net, to net income. It's used to assess a company's profitability and financial performance. So, Mr. Nigel Edwards, director, appearing before Parliament's Joint Select Committee, said that this measure of Petrotrin's profitability and performance was good. And he went on to tell the JSE that based on the board's plan of action, it projected that free cash flows would be developed of $1.2 billion US between 2018 and 2022. Now, this is in February of 2018, just 6 months before the announcement to shut down. They were very upbeat about Petrotrin's performance. So we could show, for example, from Petrotrin's 2017 accounts that there was significant improvement, and these are now the audited financial statements of Petrotrin, where the loss position was cut by some 50%, and not only was the loss cut by 50%, but the company actually made a profit on its operations. That is, when you take into account the cost of the inputs of the purchase of crude oil and the revenue from the sale of products, there was a surplus. And so it was profitable in terms of operations. Now, it lost money, and we'll explain that a little bit later on. The company chairman is also reported as saying in the Trinidad and Tobago Guardian on July 18, 2018, that the company made a net profit of $85.6 million for the second quarter of 2018. That the company had free cash flows, remember I described what that was a while ago, of 1.76 billion TT dollars for the first 9 months of the financial year, and earned $18 billion for that same period, a 21% increase over the previous year. In other words, for the first 9 months of 2018, the company had revenues of 18 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars. All of this was significant improvement. And Mr. Espinay was making this statement in July of 2018, just a month before it was decided to close down. Now, I'm going back now to the Petrotrin's R&M performance report of 2018 and looking at the economic summary. And in that economic summary, because we're looking now at the performance of the refinery in April of 2018. And the actual gross margin, and let me explain what the gross margin is. The gross margin is the amount of revenue minus the amount of your expenditure for crude oil. So your refining of your crude gives you products, and those products have a value, and then that, of course, takes also into consideration the cost of refining, and then you subtract from that the expenditure, how much you paid for the crude oil that went into making those products. So the gross margin for 2018 was 338 million TT dollars, because your revenue was 1,860,000, and your feedstock cost of crude, was $1,783,000. So your gross margin was $338 million. So the refinery was profitable in terms of its operations. And then you have to take out other expenses, your fixed expenses, your variable expenses, your total direct expenses, that'll be like wages and so on. And then you come to still an operating surplus. So the wages for the refinery, right? Because you said, you know, the demonization of Petrotrin workers, that the workers were making too much money and there were too many workers and that false narrative and so on. So your total direct expenses, $124 million. Still left you with an operating surplus of $213 million. And then you had to take out of that now your corporate overhead. That is like your CEO and all of those other people like that and so on, 24.5 million. Then you have to take out depreciation and amortization, which is not an actual expenditure, it is a financial accounting. And that gave free cash of $114 million. And then you took out your interest as your payment on your loans and so on, and you came down to net income before tax of $36.5 million. And when they looked at the position up until the end of April for the financial year, from October to April, the actual budgeted figures, we will also see what that was. And then we look at, so that was a very important set of information. And for that month of April, what we saw was that there was what we call an indicative margin of $10.80 TT per barrel. In other words, the refinery was able to have a positive position in terms of the cost of refining and the revenues from that refining of $10.80 TT per barrel. So the narrative that the refinery was losing $4 a barrel was a false narrative. So we are continuing the story about the Petrotrin was losing $4 a barrel. And I want to now look at the management accounts for 2018 August, which was up to the 11th month of the financial year 2018, and therefore was the last set of information that the board and the government would have had before it announced the closure. And what did that show? That showed that in terms of the expenditure for crude, it purchased foreign crude, and this is TT dollars, in the amount of, this is up for the 11 months, $13,453,000 foreign crude. It purchased crude from Premier Consolidated Limited, a small oil company, $39 million. Other crude, which it got from some other producers, NGC and EOG and so on, $415 million. And then, of course, its own crude, so it costed the crude that it got from its own producing fields at $4,234,000, and from lease and farm out operators, these are small operators that are using Petrotrin's fields and producing some oil, and selling that $1,129,000. So that the total purchases of crude came up to $19,611,000, and this is for the first 11 months of 2018 up to August, and you've seen that on your screen. On the revenue side now, local sales, $4,820,000. Remember I talked about the share that went to local. Regional, $5,434,000. Extra regional, $4,323,000. And international, $7,079,000. Now remember, regional, extra regional, and international, which is about $17 billion, that would have been earned in foreign exchange. So divide that by 6.7 or whatever it is, you will see that Petrotrin was earning in foreign exchange $2.5 billion US dollars a year for this country. Its total sales, therefore, was $21,657,000. So when you take away your cost of crude from your revenue, you then got a gross margin, which is your, how you, as I said, how you calculate your profitability. That came up to $2,670,000. In other words, just on operations alone, $2,672,000. So that model of importing crude and refining it enabled Petrotrin in sale of products to be profitable to the extent of $2,600,000 for the 11 months of 2018. But out of that now you have to take out your other expenses, your operating expenses, which would be your wages and salaries for the 11 months, $1,460,000. Then you had other overheads, and we'll explain what some of those are. $207 million. General overheads, $95 million. Depreciation and amortization, $783 million, which is not an actual expenditure. It is a financial thing. In other words, that you provide for your depreciation, so you put aside money, or should put aside money to do repairs and maintenance and so on. And that gave you total expenses of $2,400,000, which still left you with an operating surplus of $269,968,000 TT dollars. So Petrotrin at the end of August, just at the time they were closing, had an operating surplus, not a loss, operating surplus, when you took out all the expenditure, of $269.9 million TT dollars. But at financial terms, it then had a loss, and its loss ended up being $624 million. So how do we move from that position of operating surplus to a loss? And that developed because of the interest that it was paying on its loans of $689,900,000. And then it had another loan, $20,500,000, and then there were some other finance costs and so on. And of course, there was a pension benefit expense and that kind of thing. But the main items was over $700 million rather, in paying its loans. And that is what put Petrotrin into financial trouble. And we will come back to that a little later on when we look at the loans. But let me just talk a little bit about the costs that were allocated in terms of wages and salaries to the refinery costs, yes? So the actual workers, from the laborer all the way up to the manager and so on, superintendents and that kind of thing, that came up for the 11 months up to the end of August of 2018 to $672 million. Marketing and trading, the people in doing the buying of crude and the selling of products, that came up to $62 million. So a total expense of people involved in the refinery operations and marketing was $743,300,000. But here it is, corporate support, which, remember, all expenses go against the refinery, yes? Corporate support, the President's Group, $145,342,000. Finance Group, $165,300,000. Human Resource and Corporate Services, as like public relations and corporate communications and so on, $285 million. So that group of management, top management, who were actually not producing oil, not refining oil, not selling oil, that came up to $596,257,000, which is very close to the $743 million that was the amount that was paid in wages and salaries to the people who are actually engaged in refining and marketing of that crude. And that is where when we look at the issue of restructuring later on, that is where some of the restructuring and cost savings could have taken place. But the government demonized the workers, saying that a laborer was getting $20,000 a month, which was not true, and so on. And other workers were getting $40,000 and $50,000 a month, technicians, which was not true. But they never spoke about where the real extra expenses that went on into Petrotrin took place. Because you see, you can't hire somebody who's a party person to be a refinery operator that easily. That person has to be trained, otherwise you'll blow up your plant. But you could hire people in admin and corporate comm and areas like that. I'm not demonizing them, I'm just saying that is where you could bring people in quite easily because the skill level is different. That is why that area was so bloated in terms of expenditure relative to the people who are actually engaged in refining and marketing. And of course, the same would have applied to exploration and production. So let me deal with the false narrative number 3, that Petrotrin was a ward of the state. I'm sure you heard that said many times. Petrotrin was a ward of the state. In other words, that we, the taxpayers, were mining Petrotrin. And because we were mining Petrotrin, taxpayers' money wasn't available for buying medicine and providing beds in the hospital and providing food cards for people and providing old age pension and disability grants and providing free meals for children in school and so on and so on and so on, because taxpayers' money was supporting Petrotrin and not going to help you, the citizens. And many citizens bought that and said, well, boy, we had to get rid of Petrotrin because Petrotrin preventing me from getting all the things that I need. Well, that was a false narrative. And we always maintain that position. I want to say that nowhere in any report was this statement made that Petrotrin was a ward of the state. Not in the affidavits and evidence of Mr. Espede and Mr. Dan Paul, then Permanent Secretary, Minister of Finance, now Minister of Finance, in the industrial court. None of them ever said that taxpayers' money went to Petrotrin. You can't find a single budget document, not a single budget document, where there are details of transfers and subsidies, and they're very detailed. I didn't bring them, but they're very detailed documents which show where all the money is supposed to be going in this country. Not a single document dealing with transfers and subsidies said that the taxpayers' money was going to Petrotrin. The Lashley report, and I was a member of that committee, did not make that either. Now, subsequent to us making these points over and over again, some enlightened citizens actually did a Freedom of Information request, and they got the information from the Ministry of Finance that said that no transfer or subsidy was ever provided to Petrotrin. So there was a false narrative that Petrotrin was a ward of the state, and that narrative was given to sell a story for the public to buy in to justify the closure of the company and the refinery and sending home all of the workers. What are the facts? What are the facts? The fact is that Petrotrin actually contributed massively to government's revenue over the years, and therefore Petrotrin contributed to you getting a food card, or to getting disability grant, or to getting school meal for your children, or to getting old age pensions, or to be able to buy medicines through CDAP, or to provide hospital beds and maintain schools and build roads and so on. Petrotrin contributed immensely to all of that. And so, according to the Trinidad and Tobago Extractive Industry Transparency Report, and the TTI report is the authoritative multipartite bodies, government, civil society, and corporate energy companies are members of it with an independent chair, that addresses energy company contributions to government's revenue. And you can go online and read these reports. Between 2004 and 2016, Petrotrin actually contributed $49 billion in direct taxes and royalties to the government of Trinidad and Tobago, therefore to Trinidad and Tobago's well-being. Yes? And Petrotrin was probably the second largest contributor to government revenue between 2004 and 2016. Between 2010 and 2016, Petrotrin contributed $20 billion to the government's revenue. And I'm just going to show you one slide for the TTEITI report of 2014 to 2015, and you will see there that Petrotrin contributed $4.1 billion just for those 2 years. But there were indirect contributions as well, so that all those workers employed by Petrotrin would have paid personal income taxes, so that also came into the government's coffers. Contractors who worked for Petrotrin had company corporate taxes paid, and their employees also paid tax. Petrotrin's tax was calculated at a level above virtually every other energy company. They paid what is known as supplemental petroleum tax if the price of oil went above a certain amount because they produced oil. They paid petroleum profits tax of 55%, petroleum levy, petroleum impost, green fund, plus royalties. No other energy company was taxed in the same way that Petrotrin was, because Petrotrin was a state company, so the government said, let us take as much as we can out of Petrotrin. The multinational companies upstream and tax like that who are producing your natural gas and so on. In fact, many of them are getting away with murder because they engage in what is known as transfer pricing. So they buy, they are selling their natural gas at, for argument's sake, $5, but they sell it to a subsidiary, and that subsidiary then sells it for $7. So they pay taxes on 5, but really and truly they should be paying taxes on 7. The difference between 5 and 7 is gravy for the multinational companies. That's known as transfer pricing. And they've been ripping off this country for years, and we have lost probably 50, 60 billion or more in terms of revenue that way. And then some of the companies, all their expenses, so they're investing in a new platform, or they're doing major maintenance and so on, pipelines. All that cost is deducted from the revenue that they earn, and therefore their tax take is reduced. Petrotrin had none of those luxuries. So we were beating up on Petrotrin, but the real culprits were the multinational oil companies who were not paying their fair share of taxes. So let me now talk about the fact that Petrotrin did owe the government taxes for some years. That is a fact. We're not going to deny that. And that is because the when the price of oil fell beginning in 2014, and it fell quite significantly, Petrotrin then found itself in some difficulty, because you see, Petrotrin, as I was just describing, had to pay tax even though it was in a loss position. And so the Lashley report, which was up until March of 2017, based on information from the Board of Inland Revenue, and we're putting this up on the screen, Petrotrin, according to the BIR, would have owed some $3.1 billion. However, there were some deductions that had to come out of that, and because the government also owed Petrotrin because of the fuel subsidy. Petrotrin would sell to NP and Unipet at the market price of gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel. However, at the pump, consumers would pay the subsidized price. So the difference between the subsidized price, which you pay at the pump, and the market price is the amount of the subsidy. And the government, therefore, would have to pay Petrotrin that subsidy so that Petrotrin could recover the full value of the products that it was producing and selling on the local market. But the government had stopped paying Petrotrin that subsidy. So the government owed Petrotrin $741,600,000 and interest of $33 million. It owed a certain amount of value-added tax and so on. And there was, Petrotrin said that they also overpaid a certain amount of royalties. And therefore, the net amount that Petrotrin was owing as of March of 2017 was $1.26 billion. So the government did not get $1.26 billion in taxes that it should have gotten, but which Petrotrin remember, was still contributing immensely to the country in so many other ways. But we don't hide the fact that for a period it wasn't contributing taxes. Let me also say though that when COVID hit, companies, not Petrotrin because it was closed down, this was 2020, 21, 22, refineries all of a sudden started to make super profits. So that refinery margin that I spoke about would have tripled if we still had the Point-de-Paix refinery running during the COVID period. And when that refinery margin tripled and Petrotrin therefore would have made humongous profits, it would have been able to clear off all of its tax debt to the government of Trinidad and Tobago. So that is what that reality is. Let me also say that Petrotrin carried the entire cost of LPG, which amounted to some $200 million a year. So we got, every citizen who buys gas, cooking gas, got gas that Petrotrin effectively produced at a cost of $200 million and never got paid a cent for. So Petrotrin was never a ward of the state. That was a false narrative. False narrative number 4. Petrotrin's debt, and especially the 2 bonds outstanding, would have bankrupted Trinidad and Tobago and caused the country's downgrade by the ratings agencies like Moody's, Standard & Poor's, S&P, and Fitch, and so on. There are 3 major ratings agencies. Now, the fact is that Petrotrin had 3 major types of debt. One, a long-term bond of $850 million US, and that was a bullet payment arrangement. What does that mean? It means that interest was being paid in full all the time, and the full principal amount of the $850 million US would have been due in August of 2019. The second major debt was a long-term bond of $750 million US, and this was like a normal loan that you would go to the bank for, where Petrotrin was paying both the principal and interest. And then there were some short-term revolving loans amounting to about $200 million. But this was not something that Petrotrin owed $200 million at any one time. This was essentially a line of credit so that it enabled Petrotrin to meet its payments to companies that it purchased crude from, as the same products, the sale of products would take place sometime afterwards. So there's a time lag. You have to buy your crude in the month of April, and then by the time you refine and sell, that might be the month of beginning of June, and you may get paid for that 2-3 months after that, which will be, say, July, August. But the guys who you bought the crude from in April want their money more or less right away. So between April and June, July, you don't have the cash flow to be able to pay for the crude that you bought. So what Petrotrin had was a revolving loan where they would say to a bank where they had this arrangement, we need some money to pay for the crude, and when we get the sale of product, we will pay you back. So it's a line of credit, and many businesses in this country know what a line of credit is. Significantly, let me just say that none of these loans, absolutely none of these loans, were ever guaranteed by the government of Trinidad and Tobago, none. And that evidence also came out in the industrial court, and you could read the transcripts of the evidence of Mr. Dan Paul, Permanent Secretary, and others, Espinay. Not a single loan that Petrotrin had was guaranteed by the government. That short-term revolving loan, the banks at some point in time in 2017 or thereabouts asked the government to give them a letter of comfort. It wasn't a hard, and Dan Paul was clear in his evidence in the industrial court, it wasn't a hard guarantee. They wanted a letter of comfort that in case something happened and Petrotrin didn't pay, would the government pay? And the Minister of Finance said, okay, in that event, yes, the government would pay, but it was not a guarantee. Yes, in any case, Petrotrin was able to manage all of its debts and meet all of its payments. So, no government guarantee on any of those loans whatsoever. The only time the issue of a government guarantee came up was after the announcement of the closure of Petrotrin. At the end of August 2018, August 28th, when the announcement was made then the people who are owed money by Petrotrin say, well, if you're closing down the company, you're shutting down the refinery, we don't know how we're getting paid, because we used to get paid out of the sale from the refinery. So if you close it down, we don't know what is happening. So we now want a government guarantee. And we have to go to the government because Petrotrin is being closed down. That was the only time the issue of government guarantee ever came up in a firm way, where after the announcement had been made. So what was the status of those debts? The $850 million US bullet payment attracted an interest rate of 9.75%. That was a very high interest rate. And it was over a 10-year period. And so it was due in 2019, so that money would have been borrowed in 2009. It was for the refinery upgrade, the gas optimization project. And Petrotrin had to pay 500 million TT dollars a year for those 10 years in interest alone. And it was, in fact, paying that interest faithfully. Remember I mentioned in the accounts that they were spending like $700+ million a year in interest payments. Well, so $700 million a year in interest. That is what that was. And then the $750 million US loan, which was the loan that they were paying interest and principal on, that was for 12 years, and it was going to be paid off in full in 2022. So money was borrowed in 2010, and that interest rate was 6% a year, and required Petrotrin to pay another 500 million TT per year for 12 years in principal and interest. Now in 2018, that 750 million had come down in principal, because remember you're paying principal and interest all the time, so your principal is being reduced. That principal in 2018 was only 250 million US. So when the government said that these loans were massive and would have bankrupted the country and Petrotrin couldn't pay, and they talk about 850 million plus 750 million. No, it wasn't 850 million plus 750 million, because the 750 million had come down to 250 million and was being paid down all the time. And all the interest was being paid on both those loans. And then they added in the 200 million revolving loan, but that was a line of credit. It wasn't that there was 200 million that actually Petrotrin had. It was, as Petrotrin needed it, it drew down on that facility to be able to make payments for crude and so on. That was the status of the debts. And it was those debts that put Petrotrin into a loss-making situation from about 2016, when the price of oil was low, up until 2018. But as I mentioned earlier to you, the financial statement of 2017 showed an improvement. The statement by Mr. Espinay in July of 2018 showed that there was improvement. The statement by Nigel Edwards before the Joint Select Committee of Parliament in February of 2018 showed that things were improving and that Petrotrin was doing better. I showed you the April 2018 refinery performance information. I showed you the August 2018 financials, which showed that the refinery was making an operating surplus. So the issue really was that debt. Could they get the debt reduced? And the answer to that is yes. When we won the Lashley Committee, and I will talk a bit about that in a little while, the Lashley Committee we were asking, are we supposed to also look at the issue of Petrotrin's debt? And we were told no, other people are looking at that. Because the reality is that the Ministry of Finance and others had people raising money internationally. The government had a bond issue that they raised in 2017, I think it was, and they got $1 billion US, and at a lower interest rate than the 9.75%, because remember in 2008, there was a financial collapse on Wall Street and interest rates came down to almost zero. So it was possible to refinance these debts, the 850 million and the balance of the 250 million, refinance that at lower interest rates. So therefore, the cost to Petrotrin in terms of having to put out all that money to pay debts could have come down. And that would have eased up the burden on Petrotrin, enabled it to breathe, enabled it to pay its taxes, and do all the other things it had to do. So those loans could have been refinanced. And many of us know about that. We have a loan, 2 loans, and we go by the credit union, don't you? and you consolidate those two loans, and the credit union interest rate lower than the bank interest rate. So we know about doing those things. Everybody does that. So that is what could have been done to reduce that debt burden. So that is the false narrative number 4. False narrative number 5, that the rating agencies were going to downgrade Trinidad and Tobago. Now, I gave evidence before the industrial court, and I can't show you all of that documentation, but trust me, I have it. It's a big bundle of documents, I'll just put it up on the camera for you to see, but I can't put this up on the screen. There are too many things here. This was my affidavit before the industrial court in 2018 after the announcement of the closure. And I attached to my affidavit, and they were labeled DA1, DA2, DA3, and so on, plus press releases by the Ministry of Finance. I attached a whole set of documents, right, including what Standard & Poor's had actually said and what Moody's has actually said. So like I attached these things, this is what it looks like. Moody's, yes? That was one report, and I went through several years, Moody's and so on, and Standard & Poor's as well, right? This one is Standard & Poor's, Ratings Direct. So I gave evidence on this before the industrial court, and I was cross-examined by the company's, Petrotrin's attorney, Reginald Amor, senior counsel. He couldn't shake my testimony and my evidence. I was also cross-examined by the Attorney General's counsel, who was Mr. Jairam Sinat, and he couldn't shake it either. And in fact, the union's senior counsel, Douglas Mendez, punched a lot of holes in Mr. Dan Paul's evidence about the ratings agencies. A lot of holes were punched in that. And one of the things that the Minister of Finance said in a press release is in 2018, the press release was dated the 29th of April 2018. The Ministry of Finance was very happy to say that, quote, "It is noteworthy that this is the first time in 3 years that Trinidad and Tobago's credit rating has not been downgraded by S&P, which is welcome news." In other words, April 29, 2018, no fear of Petrotrin causing a downgrade, no fear at all. Ministry of Finance, very happy. S&P did not, first time in 3 years that our credit rating did not get downgraded by S&P. And the fact of the matter is that previous downgrades happened not because of Petrotrin, absolutely not. And Dan Paul himself couldn't point to any Petrotrin factor that caused previous downgrades when he was cross-examined in industrial court. The downgrades happened because government revenue fell. We were running a big deficit on our budget. Oil prices had fallen and many things like that. And that is why we were downgraded. Had nothing to do with Petrotrin whatsoever. So narrative number 5, I think it is, that was false, that the ratings agencies would downgrade us because of Petrotrin. False narrative. Now, they did threaten a downgrade in October of 2018, but that was after the announcement to close, or September, October 2018, after the announcement was closed, because they were not sure how the restructured company would be able to pay all of the debt. And therefore they said, if we are not clear about what is going to happen, we may have to downgrade Petrotrin and therefore the country. But of course, they were then satisfied that the restructuring would take care of that. But they actually never said they would downgrade because of Petrotrin's debt. That was false narrative number 5. Now, how was the decision made to close Petrotrin? How was that decision made? In the industrial court, the chairman of Petrotrin, Mr. Espinay, was asked that question by the union's counsel, Douglas Mendez. He was asked, who made the decision? And Mr. Espinay never answered who. All he said was, the numbers made the decision. All that was presented were 3 PowerPoint slides prepared by a consulting company called McKinsey and Associates, which company, if you Google them, has a very bad track record in many parts of the world where it comes to doing things wrong and so on. But 3 PowerPoint slides. There was not a single study that recommended the closure of the refinery and the closing of Petrotrin and the sending home of all the workers. Not a single study ever recommended that. Who made the decision? The cabinet made the decision, the energy subcommittee of the cabinet, and I believe that has now come out in the public domain through a freedom of information request. So they made the decision. But the company could have been restructured differently, and restructuring was necessary. Yes, it was necessary. So that, I'll just give a narrative. I'm going on very long, probably too long, but let me just share a little bit of information with you about the way in which the restructuring could have taken place. You see, I think it was January of, I'll just try to find the exact date. In January of 2017, the Prime Minister asked to meet with me and said he's concerned about Petrotrin, and I was retired. Do I think that the union would be willing to engage in a discussion about Petrotrin? And I said, I'm sure the union would be. And I then conveyed that to the union's leadership. And as a result of that, there then was a meeting with the Prime Minister at the Prime Minister's office. And at that meeting, it was agreed that there would be set up a committee to look at the operations of Petrotrin. And the union then nominated, I was at that meeting as well, and the union then nominated myself and one other person to represent it on the committee, and that committee became known as the Lashley Committee. So I was there from the start of the issue of that committee. The Lashley Committee then produced a report, and that report has certain recommendations. Not a single recommendation is about closure or about sending home anyone. It simply recommended the following, it's important to read. 1, governance arrangements. To enable the company to have a consistent, focused mandate, facilitate long-term planning, and avoid the frequent changes in board and management, we recommend A, the members of the board of directors are selected through a process which provides for comprehensive and transparent input and feedback from key stakeholders to ensure that members possess the relevant experience and capabilities to address priority matters critical to the transformation and sustainable development of the company. B, Petrotrin adopts and adheres to the laws and regulations that apply to publicly listed companies, that is those listed on the stock exchange, especially with respect to transparency and accountability. C, Petrotrin adopts a policy whereby the board of directors' terms of office are cycled in such a manner as to ensure that at all times there's a continuity of membership of at least 50% of the board. In other words, you see what happens is with Petrotrin, every time a government changes or minister changes, you get a new board, and you have no continuity. You can't run a big company like that and change people at the top every few years who then decide that everything that happened before was wrong and they want to do it all over again. That simply can't work. So we were saying you must have continuity, and that board appointees should not simply be people the government chooses, namely party supporters and so on. You want to choose people who have been supported by, nominated by, recommended by stakeholders, yes? So that you get the best possible people. Second recommendation, organizational structure. To enable the executive and senior management to focus on strategic and operational responsibilities of managing profitable businesses for which they will be held accountable, we recommend A, the establishment of 3 operationally independent business units, namely Trinma, Land Exploration and Production, and Refining and Marketing. That each of these business units be led and managed by persons who will be responsible for organizing all of the resources, financial, human, physical, within the unit, in order to achieve the established targets and be held accountable for the business's performance. C, that the office of the president of the company be accountable for ensuring the implementation of policy across all business units, providing oversight and strategic leadership of the company. So there was no question of closure. It was a matter of ensuring a better management structure That was the restructuring that was to take place for accountability, for efficiency of decision making, and so on. That was the structure. And in addition to that decision, the board actually did meet with the union in early 2018, a new board which was appointed in August of 2017. I actually was asked by the Prime Minister to serve on that board on the 29th of August 2017, and I declined because the board was not being appointed consistent with the recommendations of the Lashley Committee, and I indicated to the Prime Minister that I could not accept an appointment that was inconsistent with the recommendations of a committee of which I was a part. So I didn't accept the appointment. But Espinay and the others who were members of the committee had no problem becoming chair and members of the new board. They did meet with the union, and then in April of 2018, they signed a memorandum of agreement so that the union would have engaged in discussions about restructuring the company. Because the union said, yes, the company had to be restructured. But those discussions, I think there were only 1 or 2 meetings, never got anywhere. And there could have been simple restructuring. Remember I mentioned the huge costs of President's Group, $145,300,000 in 11 months. Corporate expenses, Finance Group rather, $165 million. Human Resource and Corporate Services, $285 million. So part of the restructuring could have reduced those costs. Another part of the restructuring could have seen a voluntary separation of employment, because 40% of the company's employees were over 50. So quite a few people who had worked 30, 40 years, entitled full pension, may have gone home with some extra money through a voluntary separation, and therefore the workforce numbers could have come down, and the labor costs therefore come down, and therefore the company would have been more efficient, more productive, and more profitable. Those were the restructuring things that could have taken place. But that didn't happen. So, in Mr. Espinay's evidence in the industrial court in 2018, he admitted that the company had hired a vice president for refining and marketing in early August 2018. So up to early August 2018, two and a half weeks before the announcement to close down, the company was restructuring with an expat VP for R&M. They had just hired an expat VP for exploration and production. And so they had to buy out the guy who they had hired as R&M because the company was closed down, so he had agreed to a contract and so on, and then had no job, so they had to buy him out. And we have to find out how much they paid to buy him out. So up to a few weeks before the announcement to close, they were working on restructuring. Now, there have been major losses as a result, and costs as a result of what happened. Of course, 6,000 workers lost their jobs. But the cost of that was very high because you had to pay all of the workers, especially the permanent workers, severance pay. The casual workers didn't get, and temporary workers may not have gotten very much, but permanent workers had to be paid severance pay. That was a huge amount of money. Whereas if they had a VSEP, you wouldn't have had to pay them that amount of money. There's a liability to the pension plan, which is about $1 billion now, because the pension plan has stopped. No money coming in, but money is going out because people are retiring. So no money coming in, money going out. At some point in time, the pension plan will run out of money. And so there's $1 billion+ liability that will have to be met by the government, no doubt. Individual taxes of the workers, the government not getting that. Companies that no longer had a contract with Petrotrin, their tax take would be less. NIS has gone down because all these workers not working now, no NIS coming in. Foreign exchange is an issue, and Paria is actually importing refined products, and therefore has to find Forex for that. And in the central bank information of last year, the central bank said that 17% of the sales of Forex went to the energy sector, or energy companies. The only energy company that would need Forex really is Paria. So crowding out you getting foreign exchange is Paria because it needs foreign exchange to buy the products that is selling on the local market. And for a while, and we put that up as well, Paria was in trouble. and had to get the government now. Actually, Paria was a ward of the government for a short period. The government had to put money in, taxpayers' money, had to keep Paria going, to give Paria the cash that was needed to pay for the importation of crude. So that was a loss. We no longer have bitumen. So our roads are in much worse shape. And we have to import bitumen now from Jamaica and elsewhere. So that is a cost. And then all the business activity that used to spin around the refinery and with people being employed, shopkeepers, taxi drivers, small businesses, people doing catering and food, all of that declined. What in economic terms is known as the multiplier effect. All of that was lost. And then there's the loss of, with the closure, the workers, the permanent workers who were employed with Petrotrin had a medical plan. It was contributory, they paid, and so on, and they had access to hospital and medical center and private medical facilities and so on. All of those workers now are on the public health sector. So we now have to pick up as taxpayers additional people. It's not just the thousands of workers who went home, it was the retirees and the family, the spouse of the retiree and the family of the workers. So more than 10, 12,000 people now are on the public health system who would previously have been taken care of by Petrotrin. And then you look at recreation grounds that are in bad shape, fence-line communities who used to be supported in their community activities and so on. All of that has disappeared or has been reduced very, very significantly since the closure of Petrotrin. Health and safety standards have fallen. We know about the tragedy of the divers by Paria, who were hired by a contractor, hired by Paria, and then of course the well services accident down in what was the Trinmar fields before. So health and safety has gotten worse. And they boasted that oil production would go up after the closure because Heritage will be able to focus on that and get oil production up. The fact of the matter is that oil production has gone down. The refinery assets are deteriorating because they're being closed, shut down since November or before of 2018. So 6+ years have gone by. Those plant equipment is deteriorating tremendously. So all of those things have happened. And those loans, that $850 million bullet payment didn't disappear. And the $250 million that was remaining when Petrotrin was shut down, that didn't disappear. So what happened? TPHL, through Heritage and Paria, refinanced those loans. So they're still being paid. They're still being paid. And they could have been paid by refinancing them by Petrotrin. So those loans didn't disappear. Don't fool your fat about that. They're still very much there. So given all of this, why was Petrotrin shut down and all the workers sent home? Now my view, and different people have views, my view is it was to weaken the oilfields workers' trade union and restructure the labor force, because the best collective agreements in the country were in the oil industry and of course electricity. So when you get rid of the workers, all the workers went home, you got rid of the collective agreement and you got rid of the trade union. So, and Mr. Espinay said that in one of the panel discussions that I was on with him. I asked him, why, if you said the refinery is not making money, why then are you sending home all the workers in your producing fields? And he said, is it because you want to get rid of the collective agreement? And he said, yes. And I said, well, you mean you want to get rid of the union? He said, no. I said, well, to get rid of the union, you have to get rid of the collective agreement by sending home all of the workers. So they wanted to get rid of the collective agreement, restructure the labor force so that workers now are hired by labor supply only contractors like Kenson and so on, and they're making a huge amount of money by supplying labor under very poor conditions to Heritage and to Paria. And I'm going to stop the story there because I've gone on for way too long. But that is the real story, and there's more to be said, but I'm sure people will come and attack me after making this statement. And why don't we have a debate? Those who took the decision to close Petrotrin. Let us debate. You come with your false narratives, and I will come with the truth and the facts. Thank you very much.